Hey everyone, and welcome to the Tamiya Astute 2022 online build. In this video series, we'll take you step by step into the build of this super cool Tamiya buggy. But before we do, we have to go over a few things: the tools you'll need, some additional suggested tools, and a quick walk around of the instruction manual. Okay, let's get started. Okay, let's start with the suggested tools. We're going to need the following to help make this a worry-free build: a 1.5mm hex driver, a 2.0mm hex driver, a 5.5mm nut driver, a 7.0mm nut driver, a silver Sharpie, body reamer, hobby knife, calipers, and a set of turnbuckle tools. We're also going to need a set of standard pliers, needle nose pliers, scissors, shock pliers, shock building stand, CA glue, the included Tamiya 4-way wrench, and some paper towels for cleanup. Optional tools will include a parts tray, a power driver, car stand, and some thread locking compound. It's also a good idea to give the manual a quick look prior to assembly. This will help you understand the build process, familiarize yourself with screw sizes, and see any additional build info prior to each step. Okay, on to the build. Let's start by opening bag A and distributing the parts to our parts tray. This will help keep things organized during our build. Tamiya provides two sponge strips. One is a sponge sheet on the left, and the other is a sponge tape on the right. Both are used differently throughout the build. The sponge sheet is a little difficult to work with, so do your best to cut it to fit in the locations needed. There are two different length cross pins, an 8mm and a 9.8mm. Make sure you use the correct pins in the right locations. There are also a lot of different bearing sizes during this part of the build. Pay close attention to the sizes when assembling. Tamiya uses an odd pitch for their gears, and since I don't have a lot of pinions to match, I'm swapping my gears over to 48 pitch. For this build, I'll be using a 77 tooth 48 pitch spur gear. Because the hole pattern doesn't match that of the Tamiya gear, I'm only using 2 of the 6mm screws here. This part plugs the opening for the 4-wheel drive shaft used in the Super Avante. You'll need to use E6000 or similar to glue it in place. A little bit of grease here helps keep the gears lubricated. This cover might require a little finesse to install. It did on our Super Avante, but seemed much easier on the Astute. Just make sure it's fully seated before installing the 8mm screws. There are 2 wing mount heights included. We're starting with the low profile ones per the manual. There are no anti-roll bars included in the kit, making these mounting parts completely optional. Since we will eventually be using anti-roll bars, we're going ahead and installing them anyway. Here is one of the questionable moments in the build, the brushless motor install. We were able to get a standard brushless motor in our Super Avante, however it was a little bit tricky. We ran across another issue when installing it in our Astute. If you're focused on getting the motor in right now, jump ahead to roughly the 1304 mark to see our issue and how we had to fix it. Turnbuckles. Always fun to build. Well, now they are, thanks to our CompetitionX turnbuckle tool. This makes it super easy to screw the ball ends on and off. Link to our Shapeways download in the description below. Here's a pro tip. When installing turnbuckles, make sure the notch or knurled side of the turnbuckle faces the left side of the car. This makes adjustments easier when the rotations of the turnbuckle are all in the same direction. Open Bag B. Like the Super Avante, the Astute 2022 comes equipped with a ball differential. Prepare the diff spring by squeezing it a few times with your pliers. This helps settle it prior to use. A little grease on the outdrives helps keep the differential rings in place. Here's a tip on installing the differential balls. Simply cut a slit in the bag, pour them into the gear, and move them into position. Easy peasy. When mating the 2 diff halves, make sure you pay attention to the orientation. You'll need to know this when installing the diff screw in a later step. Here's another tip for installing the thrust balls. Pour the balls on something flat, like a paper towel. Add some black grease to your thrust washer assembly. Now, roll the greased assembly over the thrust balls to pick them up. Gently spread the grease into all the nooks and crannies. Don't be afraid to add more grease if you feel the need. Once the diff screw has engaged, tighten slowly and carefully for a full 7 turns. If you over tighten, you can easily strip out the plastic differential nut. More sponge sheet, and this time it's a bit more challenging. Just do your best to follow the contours of the pinion cover. A little more grease to help lubricate the gears. So right here is where we came across a major issue with the Astute 2022, the motor mounting. Because of the positioning of the motor and the height of the motor soldering tabs, the Reedy motor just wasn't going to fit. Here's the Reedy motor alongside an R1 Works motor. You can see the tabs are much lower on the R1. Once we installed the R1 motor with the better positioning, we found it fit just right and the lower chassis plate fit perfect. This is something you may need to take notice of if you are having trouble installing your Brand X brushless motor. Now that we have a different spur gear and a hotter motor, we left the motor loose until we can figure out what pinion we need. A little grease on the end of the hinge pins helps keep the pivot balls in place during the rest of the suspension arm assembly. Patience is key here, especially if you didn't put any grease on those hinge pins. The rear of the Astute 2022 is looking pretty good. Make sure the suspension arms and turnbuckle assemblies move up and down freely with no binding. It's a good idea to use a bit of the black grease to help keep the red urethane bushings in place. Once assembled, everything should swing freely with no binding. There are two sets of shocks, a set in the clear bags, or the rear shocks, and a set in the blue bags, or the front shocks. Get both of the clear bags out for this step. Add a few drops of shock fluid on the shock shaft to help lubricate the O-rings during installation. The opposite end of the new CompetitionX turnbuckle tool is designed to work with rod ends like this one. Makes installation super easy. Fill the shock to the top with fluid, then slowly plunge the shaft up and down to release any air bubbles from under the piston. Do this a few times, then set the shock aside in your shock stand while we move on. Once all the bubbles have dissipated, add a little more oil to the shock. Then slowly roll on the shock bladder, pushing any extra fluid out one side of the shock. Screw on the cap about halfway, then slowly compress the shock. Once fully compressed, screw on the cap the rest of the way. Tamiya doesn't give us a shock measurement, so the only thing we need to do is make sure both shocks are of equal length. If not, adjust the lower shock rod in or out to make them match. What are these, you ask? These mounts are for those cool rear fenders. Whew! That was a long build session. However, the rear end of your Astute 2022 is done and looking great. Thanks for following along with the build, and if this video helped you out, why not give it a like? And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon to be notified of additional videos in this build series. Thanks for watching.